Welcome to Institute for Diplomacy and Economy YouTube channel. Today we will discuss the current situation, the current state of global terror and the fight against global terror with my guest, Dr. Mahmut Cengiz. Before starting our conversation, let me briefly introduce Dr. Mahmut Cengiz. He is an associate professor at the Department of Criminology, Law and Society of George Mason University. He is also a research scholar at Terrorism, Transnational Crime and Corruption Center. Holding 2 master's and 2 PhD degrees, Dr. Cengiz is the author of a number of books, articles, and book chapters. His academic and non-academic studies have focused on transnational crime, corruption, terrorism, money laundering, terrorist financing, and smuggling of nuclear materials. Dr. Cengiz also regularly writes for Homeland Security Today. Welcome, Dr. Cengiz, and thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thanks for having me.
Let me start with the general overview of the organizations like ISIS and al-Qaeda, because since 2019, when the international coalition against ISIS stripped off the organization from its last pieces of territory in Syria, global terror has a kind of lost its popularity in the media, and we have had new priorities like COVID and the Russian invasion of Ukraine or artificial intelligence. But recently there seems to be a surge in ISIS activities. What I mean is the recent attacks in Turkey, Russia, and Iran. I'm trying to understand what is going on with these organizations and why they are not defeated. Are they still capable organizations to hit distant geographies of the world?
I think how we can answer this question when we look at the number of attacks by both organizations and also the common belief in the Western world. So in the Western world, there's a common belief that ISIS and al-Qaeda are defeated organizations. But when we look at terrorism databases, again, we can see hundreds of thousands of attacks every year committed by both organizations. And the terrorism databases are recording thousands of incidents, varying from 7,000 to 10,000 in the last 6 years. For example, it was very close to 7,500 in the last 2 years. So how many of these incidents were perpetrated by ISIS and al-Qaeda? When you look at these details of this database, I think around 55% of these attacks were committed by ISIS and al-Qaeda. But they are not getting the sufficient attention like they did in the previous years, because mostly the scale of attacks are low. So mostly they operate in the countries they originated or they have been operating. So since they are not targeting the Western world, so that's why there's a common belief that these organizations are defeated and also are not anymore on the agendas of the governments in the Western world. Also, I think there was a critic for the US government after 9/11, because some scholars believe that US was over-focused on global terrorism. So that's why they ignored the expansion of Russia and China. So that's why there's a priority in the last decade focusing more on Russia and China, because they are seen like big threats and bigger threats than ISIS and al-Qaeda. So ISIS and al-Qaeda, when we look at, again, some details, because both organizations changed their strategies, and ISIS is operating mostly its local affiliates. Affiliates means there are regional level organizations under ISIS core or al-Qaeda core. So they splintered or they broke away from core organization, or there are like some local organizations in the region, in Africa or in the Middle East, who prefer to fight under the banner of ISIS or al-Qaeda. I think it was a strategy for local jihadist groups to be under the banner of ISIS or al-Qaeda, because they know well that if they pledge allegiance, declare loyalty to ISIS or al-Qaeda's leadership, so they will be popular organizations. So they know well that the more they are popular, the more they can get funds and the more they can get more recruits. So these organizations, ISIS today has more than in 20 countries, there are regional level ISIS branches. I think varying from some in Africa, some in Afghanistan, and some in Pakistan. Of course, ISIS core is based today in Syria. Vis-a-vis al-Qaeda, so al-Qaeda has a different strategy. Al-Qaeda used more localization policies and then convened local jihadist groups under a big umbrella, like the organization did in the Sahel, which the group formed JNIM, the acronym Jamaat al-Nusra wal-Muslimin. So this group is the merger of 4 local jihadist groups in the Sahel, mostly in the countries in Mali and Algeria. So there was a difference and the same story in Syria. We saw, for example, bringing more than 10 local jihadist groups and creating and forming HTS, which was known previously al-Nusra, Jabhat al-Nusra group. But today the group is using the name of HTS, which is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. I think also today there is another big al-Qaeda group, al-Shabaab. So this group is in the last 5 years, it is a terrorist organization with the most incidents and also with the most casualties in the last 5 years. So to answer your question, the current situation of ISIS or al-Qaeda, even though there are some common beliefs about whether both organizations are defeated or not, but when we look at the numbers and their operational capacity, I think it wouldn't be wrong to conclude that both organizations are still active and also threatening and doing some attacks. So also you talked about,
yeah, you said that they are active, but what is the trend here? The activity is it decreasing or increasing?
Varying numbers from terrorism databases. For example, last year the number of ISIS and its affiliates attacks were around 1,300, but it was 900 last year. So like several thousands incidents or several hundreds of incidents. So that's why we cannot say that there is a decreasing or increasing trend, but we can say that there is a maybe changing perceptions about the organizations, even though they are the perpetrators of hundreds of attacks, but because they are confined to the countries and the regions. So that's why they do not threaten to the Western world. So that's why we have seen that this common belief about both organizations.
So in the last 50 decades, as you mentioned, the world has spent maybe billions of dollars to fight against such groups, but still they seem to be undefeated. So what are the main reasons here? Why they are still alive?
So why they are resilient? I think it is related to many factors. I think like country context or regional context or global context, we can use, I think, several factors to explain why these groups are today resilient. I think first we should look at maybe their financial resources and also procurement of arms and explosives, and also increasing numbers of recruits for these organizations. I think more specifically, we need to look at again the conflict zones or the regions with wars, and then the Muslim community wherever they're repressed. So recently we have seen that these Muslim groups, they just compete with each other to be under ISIS or al-Qaeda because they believe that their voice can be heard by many others if they use and if they change their names. I think also we should look at the spread of Salafism and Wahhabism, because these terrorist organizations, they are using a strict interpretation of Quran and Islam. So that's why these groups are mostly under the influences of these strict interpretations and the most related to the spread of Salafism and Wahhabism. So wherever we have seen again the spread of Salafism in the Sahel, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, again, we have seen that these groups are easily recruiting more and more people because they are seen as like organizations fighting for Islam. I think also another one is economic and political reasons for these organizations. So wherever Muslim communities are getting the sense of less political representations, like in Africa. So these local jihadist groups, again, they are just, resorting to violence and then again being under the banner of ISIS or al-Qaeda. So for your question today, yes, I agree they are resilient, so they are not defeated, but it can be explained by many factors in the context of country, regions, or the global context.
You said these organizations, these ISIS and al-Qaeda affiliated organizations, do not want to be popular, and they in recent years prefer to stay more local and keep their activities in the non-Western world. Is it a matter of strategy? Is it intentional, or is it a matter of capability? How much can we attribute this trend to the success of Western security organizations?
I think since 9/11, terrorism always has been the first and the number one government agenda issue. So when we look at their capacities, even though these groups, jihadist groups, mushroomed each other, even though al-Qaeda created, because ISIS, Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, is a splinter and offshoot organization of al-Qaeda in Iraq. So over the years, we saw these evolutions from al-Qaeda in Iraq branch to today's ISIS. So even though in the last 2 decades, the Western world, I think just in several cases, the Western world in Europe recorded several attacks by these organizations. But today, these organizations, again, they are confined to the countries and the regions. But when looking at their capacity, so we can say that these groups are still capable of doing attacks targeting the Western world. But interestingly, in 2024, we saw 3 attacks by ISIS that happened in Turkey, and also the second one on January 4th in Iran, and also on March 22nd, it was in Russia. So, of course, there are so many questions about ISIS's involvement, because ISIS claimed responsibility for the attack in Iran. But when you look at the details, you can see big discrepancies about what ISIS stated in its responsibility, and also what the Iranian officials, shared with the audience about the details of operations. So even though these groups are involved in attacks in Russia and Iran, but so many questions. For example, after these attacks in Iran and in Russia, the Iranian government accused of Israel and US behind the attack in Iran. And very similar to that, in Russia again, the Russian government accused of UK and US again being behind this attack. So the question is whether they were poorly conducted by ISIS, or whether there happened infiltrations by some state actors to these organizations. So it is really much complex. And then these groups are confined to the countries and regions. But on the other hand, we have seen their spread of operation capacity in Russia and also in Iran. Of course, in Afghanistan and Pakistan, there is always growing concern about ISIS's capacity, because after the Taliban's takeover in 2021, so there happened security vacuums and immediately filled by this ISIS branch, which is ISIS Khorasan in Afghanistan and also in Pakistan. So recently, this ISIS-K spread its capacity to Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, of course, Pakistan. So that's why, even though there are no major attacks targeting the Western world, but these groups are still big threats. I think in this context also, we should talk about homegrown extremists in the Western world. So there are no group and organizational level attacks targeting the Western world, but it's been a new trend to see these inspired individuals. So they are operating like lone actors, so they don't have any formal connection with the organization. So they operate according to their own timetable. But these lone actors, they can emerge everywhere in the Western world. Actually, it is more, I think, related to radicalization, maybe trends in the Western world. And it also is coming from data. We know well that ISIS, I think, rather than al-Qaeda, is the organization inspiring more individuals in the Western world.
At this point, I want to bring in the great power politics into our discussion. As you know, the so-called new Cold War between US and China, and the rise of revisionist powers, and the war in Ukraine, Taiwan, and the decline of US this theme is a main background theme of many global issues today. Even if we are talking about environmental crisis or the international coordination for COVID pandemic, this rivalry between China and US and the rivalry between US and Russia seems to be the main dominant context. So I'm wondering is it is relationship with counterterrorism, global counterterrorism efforts. How does this hegemonic rivalry between US and China influence the fight against terrorism? Does this distract states from doing and investing enough for counterterrorism, or is counterterrorism still an area of coordination and cooperation between these powers?
Yeah, I would say yes, because there is no harmony and the states are not on the same page when it comes to, even with the definition of terrorism. I think today there is no generally accepted terrorism definition. Once terrorist is seen as another, freedom fighter. I think it is mostly the political and the interest and also priorities by the states. I think the priority for the US is to fight against ISIS and al-Qaeda because the US governments, they didn't want to again see or experience 9/11 type attack in the US. So that's why US government spent trillions of dollars in Afghanistan, in Iraq, or did military operations in more than 40 countries. So it's a priority for the US government, to fight against ISIS and al-Qaeda. But for the Chinese government, the jihadist terrorism is not a priority, even though we know well that there are still ongoing repressions in Western China. And then we know the case always, it is much similar. Wherever there happens, these repressions. And we can see people, moving to terrorism and seeing terrorism as a last resort, and then, being involved in terrorist activities or terrorist organizations. From China, as far as I know, there are some Uyghur groups fighting in Syria, and then they were under ISIS in Syria. Also, there is a second group of Uyghurs in Afghanistan, and then China is more, interested in just, following these both organizations, especially Uyghurs related to ongoing, these repressions in the country. So, for your question, for example, I would say yes, because both states or some others, they always pursue their own interest. So it is the matter of priorities for these countries.
So the coordination for counterterrorism is not a general rule, but maybe it is more depend on the identity of the terrorist group. Maybe it is easier for them to coordinate on fight against ISIS, like as far as I remember, the US government urged the Russian leadership about the possible attack before the ISIS-K attack in Moscow, right? And but it is not a general rule as far as I understand. Much more depending on the identity of the terrorist group, which group we are talking about.
Yeah. US governments, I think US intelligence officers shared some information about the attacks in Russia and Iran, and said that they shared some information like the likely ISIS attacks in the countries. But of course, we didn't get confirmation, even though there's statements from the US intel officers, but Russia and Iran kept accusing of US and behind these two attacks. So I think these accusations are showing us that they are not on the same page. Of course, creating some security vacuums. Of course, always these terrorist organizations are just benefiting from these vacuums, and they operate under these vacuums.
So what does this tell us about the future of counterterrorism? So what I understand from you is this great power rivalry, as the tensions grows, the cooperation, international cooperation for the fight against ISIS and al-Qaeda can falter, can be weakened, right?
So far, also we talked about some factors why these organizations are not defeated, because considering these existing factors that lead to creation of these jihadist organizations, and also ISIS and al-Qaeda and their affiliated organizations, it wouldn't be wrong to say that in the future we will talk about more jihadist terrorist organizations. But when it comes to international cooperation, I think with the states, I think there are still some obstacles, there are still some problems and issues. So that's why we don't see, there's countries coming together and also then fighting and effectively against terrorism. So that's why I would say that in the future we will talk more about these organizations in the future.
Yes. Lastly, I want to discuss the Turkish efforts to fight against ISIS. This is a sensitive issue because of the allegations of Turkish government's relationship with radical terrorist organizations like al-Qaeda and ISIS, especially at the onset of the Syrian civil war. But for years, the Turkish police has been conducting series of crackdowns on ISIS networks. But still, the organization seems to be quite active in Turkey, especially in recent attacks. We saw Turkey appears as an logistical hub for ISIS. So what do you think about the Turkey's efforts against fighting against ISIS? Well, do you agree with my statement that it is failing? And if so, what are the main reasons for this failure?
I think first we should look at the changing approaches against terrorism in Turkey, because before 2013, before this December 17th and 25th corruption scandals implicating some cabinet ministers and also implicating the prime minister in those years. So there was a very serious approach from Turkey fighting against this ISIS and al-Qaeda groups. But after that, after these corruption scandals, Turkish government retaliated against these investigators. Then we saw purges, like high numbers of people purged from their positions within the government. Like 40,000 police officers and more than 60,000, for example, military personnel, they were just forced to leave their positions after these purges. After 2014, that's why we saw these changing approaches to ISIS and al-Qaeda. I think also there was one case in early 2014, which was about stopping a car, a vehicle, and destined to Syria and full of weapons. After that, we saw that the investigators paid a dear cost, so they were put in the jails, and then they were still, they were sentenced to like the life imprisonment in the jails. I think after seeing these purges, after seeing how these investigators were fired, I don't think that any police officer in today's Turkey can dare to give big lens on ISIS and al-Qaeda. So I think also there is another point, because in 2014 and 2015, there were more than 30,000 ISIS militants, and almost 10% of these militants were from Turkey. I think the Western world longer debated about whether they should accept maybe these people to their countries or not. But we didn't see any discussion, any debates about this 3,000 Turkish militants. Of course, from another research, we know well that these militants for ISIS and al-Qaeda, these recruits, they are getting radicalized after joining the organizations. So which means that there were more than 30,000 radicalized militants, and 10% of them were from Turkey. So in the early 2014, 2015, when ISIS began to lose power, so these 3,000 people, we don't know, either they left Syria and returned to Turkey, or they moved to some other jihadist regions, like some other ISIS militants. So today, there's a common understanding about ISIS and al-Qaeda. So the police is not seriously giving its attention on ISIS and al-Qaeda. So that's why we saw like one Tajik militant who was involved in the attack in Russia, or some other Tajik, maybe militants attacks in Turkey. They are all showing us that ISIS is still using logistically Turkey, and also there is no serious approach against both ISIS or al-Qaeda.
Dr. Mahmut Cengiz, thank you for your valuable comments giving this broad picture of global trends in radical terrorism. And thank you for your time.